event, beginning of hopefully a series of events between CAP and New America, looking at some of the core issues related to the U.S. mission in Afghanistan. And before I start, I just want to take a moment to thank my colleagues from CAP, Colin Cookman and Carolyn Wadhams, who've been very helpful in setting up this event, as well as all the folks at New America who got this production going. And just to mention to everybody in the room, this event will be webcast on the New America website. So to all of you watching on the webcast, welcome. The focus of this panel, as well as the series of panels going forward, is to assess U.S. options in Afghanistan. And we've really hit, I think, an important point, obviously, in this debate. And it's an important point in debate about what to do in Afghanistan, U.S. options in Afghanistan. And I think it's in part reflective of the large turnout we have today for this event. We are in the midst, of course, of a high-level discussion in the White House about the next steps in Afghanistan and whether to shift the strategic and operational focus of U.S. operations there. But like so many policy debates in Washington, there tends to be more confusion than clarity. So one of the ideas we had, and Carolyn and I had when we were setting up this panel and future ones, was to bring a little more clarity to this debate and bring some smart voices together from a range of disciplines, the diverse set of backgrounds and viewpoints to shed light on what is shaping up to be, I think, the most critical foreign policy debate of this administration. And one of the key elements of that debate has been a focus on testing key assumptions about Afghanistan, key assumptions about U.S. interests there, and the nature of the enemy that the U.S. confronts. And that's part of what I'm going to try to do today as we go forward with these forums. And we brought together three people who really, I think, reflect a pretty diverse set of viewpoints and backgrounds and experiences in Afghanistan. And so what I'm going to do here is actually introduce one at a time, do the bio, and then I'll let them speak, and so that you have a better sense of who they are before they begin to talk. And I'll start at the far end with Christina. Christina Fair is assistant professor at the Center for Peace and Security Studies at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. Previously, she served as a senior political scientist with the RAND Corporation, a political officer at the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan in Kabul, and she's a senior research associate at the U.S. Institute for Peace Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention. She's co-authored and co-edited several books, including Treading Softly on Sacred Ground, Counterinsurgency Operations on Sacred Space, The Madrasa Challenge, Militancy and Religious Eradication in Pakistan, and Fortifying Pakistan, the Role of U.S. International Security Assistance. And what I wanted to, Christina is going to deliver about 10 or 15 minutes of remarks, but one thing I want to ask her about to sort of set up her talk, she has sort of advocated more of a containment, counterterrorism-based approach in Afghanistan. And I'm curious talk a little bit about why you think that's the best option, but also how do you match that particular operational focus with larger U.S. strategic interests in the region? In other words, how does your sort of definition of U.S. interests in Afghanistan and Pakistan lead you to advocate such an approach?
Oh, right now?
Yep.
Okay. Well, I'm actually going to be even more brief than that and more sedate than usual. So yes, it is true that I am in fact a coin skeptic, counterinsurgency skeptic. The reasons for that are somewhat straightforward. We do know from previous studies of counterinsurgency that they're most effective when you actually have a government which is at least moderately effective in the provision of services and at least moderately enjoys the support of the population. Now, clearly, we don't have that in Afghanistan. And I don't want to get too wrapped around the particulars of the election, because for those of you who've been following Afghanistan, you know that the election is simply the apex of a lot of other nastiness that sits well below it. So the election, I think, typified the brazenness of the Karzai government and the absolute impunity with which that government acted. But I also think that the election and the events leading up to it also typified the complicity of the international community. So when I was there in May of 2008, the institution that was all the rage was the Independent Directorate for Local Governance. And everyone just thought this was going to be fabulous, or so they said, until you got them to speak more frankly. The principle behind the IDLG was that it was going to provide a mechanism to appoint governors at the district and provincial levels on a basis of merit rather than personal patronage ties or other political favor giving and returning from the Karzai regime. Yet once you had your official meetings about how fabulous the IDLG is and all of the international donors that were supporting it, and you went to the dinner phase and you had a beverage or two, everyone laughed and called it the Karzai re-election campaign. Reason for that's very clear. They weren't using the IDLG to necessarily appoint governors on the basis of merit, but rather those that would actually support him. So as early as May of 2008, and I suspect before, the structural lineaments of a flawed election were already in place, as was the complicity of the international community. Everyone saw this coming and largely did nothing. When I was there again in March 2009, everyone had realized that they had a little bit of a mess on their hand. Folks went from saying there's no other alternative, a phrase which I particularly find loathsome, to there is nothing worse for the counterinsurgency effort than 5 more years of Karzai. But by March of 2009, the dice had already been rolled. Reason being, it was already clear that the election was going to be postponed for controversial reasons. It need not be rehashed here. But this put the international community in a very strange position of having to support continuity of governance, which Karzai and virtually every other Afghan read as continuity of the incumbent. And going into the election, I mean, many Afghans sort of felt as if the electoral result was sort of predetermined. I was there as an electoral monitor, I guess we're calling it now, and I was working on the way in which the security environment shaped the ultimate outcome of the election. And it was very clear that from registration to the casting of voting, or the casting of the ballots, security was not only a hindrance, but it was also used explicitly as an opportunity to create opportunities for fraud. And we can go into more details, if you like, in the Q&A. But my basic concern is that without a government in Kabul, what we are, that is reasonably transparent, that enjoys reasonably the confidence of its citizenry, I don't know what we can do there. And one of my favorite examples of showing that even if we had the best plans in place that were fully resourced, both with money and with people, and I want to be very clear, that's not the case at present, we still can't succeed. The example I like to give is police training. As with Iraq, everyone came to police training a little bit late, but we know from the counterinsurgency literature that it's police that win insurgencies, not armies, and certainly not foreign armies. So counterinsurgency is the police game. Like Iraq, we came to it late in Afghanistan. We can talk about number of fumbles the Germans had at first. The Italians had Ministry of Justice reform. But in any event, by 2005, it was clear that we had to do something about police. Different plans kind of got off to a bad start. Nothing really crystallized until the last few years when the United States in particular rolled out what's called Focused District Development, FDD. The principle of FDD was that at the district level, you had a bunch of corrupt police officers. So you yank the police officers out and you give them 8 weeks of training. Now, one can already question the sanity and wisdom of 8 weeks of training to get these Afghan police officers up to speed, but that's the plan. Now, at the political level, the district governor wasn't changed, no corrupt notable. At the political level, the structure remained absolutely the same. So you pull the police out, you hose them off, and you put them right back in the mud puddle. And then you are surprised with police recidivism. So very clearly, even if we had the best configured police training program without some commitment to clean up the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Justice, not to mention other individuals that are non-governmental actors that are engaged in criminality, how can we possibly succeed in police reform? So I kind of think of myself as a post-coin thinker. I'm thinking we have to sort of get over the idea. I mean, I'm just putting this on the table. I think the time has come when someone should be asking the question, what happens if we can't win coin? And we need to revisit and interrogate some of the standard bromides that we are often fed to justify what we're doing there, the continued escalation of troops. Incidentally, if you look at the polling data, I mean, Afghans don't really welcome the infusion of foreign troops. Now, you can question the validity of any given poll. In fact, I have. But if you don't focus on any one-point estimate and you instead look at the trend's very clear. I mean, they really are increasingly less tolerant. Moreover, there's a really clear reason for it. The more we put in, the more kinetics they engage in, civilian casualties scale up. And Afghans don't blame the Taliban, even for those people that they kill. Rather, they blame us because if we weren't there, there'd be no insurgency, there'd be no Taliban, there'd be no civilian casualties. So the particular logic of these events in Afghanistan raise a number of concerns for me. But going back to the sort of post-coin question, I'm of the view that the Americans, the international community, we can't win coin. Coin is inherently a domestic process. And if you don't have capable and competent Afghan national security forces, which our own efforts to create are hindered by Kabul itself, I'm dubious that this coin effort will win. So this brings me to ask a number of questions for which I don't have the answers, and I do this for a living. So I would like some answers. So let's go back to what we hear all the time. If the Taliban come back, Al-Qaeda will come back. Well, for crying out loud, the Taliban never left because they're Afghan. So I get somewhat exhausted with the Iraq comparison because Al-Qaeda were not Iraqi. 98-ish% of the suicide bombers came from Saudi Arabia. So the Sunni uprising, which some folks attribute to the surge, I don't in particular, but this had a lot more to do with Iraqis getting tired of these foreigners, definitely making their quality of life unlivable. So this is not something that immediately transfers to Afghanistan because the Taliban are there, and the Taliban haven't left. They may run across the border for recuperative retreat, but this does not mean that they left. And in fact, if you look at the United Nations Department of Safety and Security map, I have them from 2004, most recently to July 2009. What you see is the Taliban have steadily increased their consolidation in the south. And I was actually in Kunduz for the election, thank goodness, briefly. But what you see happening is in the north, in Kunduz, Baghdad, Baghlan, they are really consolidating their position while everyone's sort of sleeping. So this idea that the Taliban have left is just simply not there. So the first question I have then, the Taliban are there. They participated in some measure in the election, and their participation ranged in a variety of ways. One, they either directly participated in the provincial councils, they ran through proxy, or they simply facilitated the movement of stuffed ballot boxes for Karzai. So that's another form of participation. So, the question has to be asked, I don't believe Haqqani and I don't believe that Mullah Omar at all are reconcilable. But, clearly this Taliban term is not as monolithic as it seems, even if their leadership behaves in a more coordinated fashion than had been previously believed. So this is a fake dichotomy that all the Talibs are crazy and fanatical and can't be dealt with, or that they are strategically operating at a level previously unseen. In fact, there's a lot of range across these different positions. So given the Taliban have already tacitly begun this process of political, I don't want to say integration, because I think that's an unfair term, one has to just be realistic. So since the Taliban are there, and they're likely to be there, what does it mean for al-Qaeda? I think it's arguable there's more al-Qaeda in Pakistan, and I would defer to people who are far more knowledgeable about this than I am. However, looking at the press reporting, it does appear as if there are and have been more al-Qaeda operatives in Pakistan than in Afghanistan. And to a first level approximation, although this is not entirely true, my understanding is that al-Qaeda is not running all over Afghanistan. Traditionally, it's been housed in Kunar and Nuristan, although there is evidence that they're floating around. So my question would be this. Whatever y'all think is the plan A, and whatever plan A we go along with, I'm an advocate of a plan B. And plan B asks these questions. What happens if we try resourcing this and we send more American men and women to die in defending a government that does seem increasingly indefensible? How do we still secure our interests? And what are our interests? I'm somewhat exhausted with we're there because of 9/11. I mean, it's enough time has marched on that we need a better explanation for our presence there. And so I'm simply advocating for a plan B. I'd like the government to explain to us. I'd like us to have a political discussion about what are our stakes there. What is the relationship between al-Qaeda and the Taliban? Can we secure our interests vis-a-vis al-Qaeda even if there is some political reconciliation or some other way by which this coin outcome doesn't plan out as the coin advocates suggest? I have a regional set of concerns as well. It strikes me as supremely ironic that as we pump in more troops into Afghanistan, who do we need more? We need Pakistan ever more. This is in part because the majority of the logistics supporting the Afghan effort moves through Afghanistan. Now, there are those proponents of the northern route. I'm a northern route skeptic for a number of reasons. You still need a port. Russia has not acquiesced in delivery of lethal goods, and to fight a war, you do need to move lethal goods to the theater. And more damning is that they're moving through Kunduz, which is an area controlled by the Germans, and in which the Taliban have made a remarkable seizure. And since the Germans are there thinking that they're doing a peacekeeping operation, and increasingly there's no peace to keep, it's not a surprise, therefore, that those routes are being intercepted. The other likely route, of course, is Iran. And I've advocated, although for reasons that some of you know, I'm going to demur from elaborating this further. Let us just say that the Italians are moving things through Herat, and a number of NATO partners that have no issue with Iran in a tactical sense, even if they have strategic concerns with the nuclear program, have considered moving things through Chabahar. And there are private sector arrangements. The Indians, for example, have done a lot of work building the Chabahar port. So one can certainly imagine routes that would communicate to the Pakistanis that we are not joking around. Can you imagine moving stuff through Iran? That would really signal to the Pakistanis that we are no joking serious, that we want to diminish our reliance upon them. But that's probably not going to happen. So for a number of reasons that are apparent. But this does raise a very interesting irony, that I'm going to argue that more of our interests reside in Pakistan. So this idea that we have to stabilize Pakistan to stabilize Afghanistan is completely backwards. There are more terrorists in Pakistan, and these terrorists are not just focusing, the Pakistan Taliban that we hear so much about, they are the enemies of Pakistan. But if we did a Venn diagram of all of the terrorists running around Pakistan and operating in and from Pakistan, what we see is that the Pakistan Taliban is a subset. And if you look at the Waziristan operations, Maulvi Nazir, who certainly sends suicide bombings to target international and Afghan troops in Afghanistan, remains an asset of the Pakistanis. They've already said we're not going after Maulvi Nazir because he's helping us against the Pakistan Taliban. So if you actually look at the ground and you get over this word, the Taliban, because it means different things in different theaters, what you actually see is that we have pretty serious disagreements with the Pakistanis. So you've got al-Qaeda, you've got international terrorist groups, you've got the specter of nuclear proliferation. And because we need Pakistan, we really don't have any sort of space to actually pressure Pakistan. And if you look at the flap that came out over the Kerry-Lugar bill, which reflects an enormous, an unprecedented generosity of the American people, and the military establishment rubbished it because we dared suggest that the Pakistan army should actually be participating in the war on terrorism for which they've been paid, as opposed to undermining it. This caused quite a flap. So, in short, I'm a coin skeptic, and I think that whatever the outcome that we're hoping for, I believe in Plan Bs, and Plan Bs are not making Plan As work when they've demonstrated that Plan A doesn't work. So I think we sort of have to imagine this coin as a very unpleasant speed bump, and we're careening into the air. And despite the fact that coin may or may not work out as we had hoped, we still need to ask basic questions. How do we continue to secure our interests? Are our interests really al-Qaeda? Some people disagree about, by the way, I think al-Qaeda is important, which is why I'm an advocate of a counterterrorism approach, but not everyone agrees that al-Qaeda still matters. So irrespective of what happens to coin, the government needs to ask, and it needs to communicate to us, what are our supreme national security interests, and how can we achieve them, even if this coin approach simply fails? Thank you.
That was great, Christina. Thank you very much. I'm about to introduce Alex there. He has the unfortunate need to actually respond to that really excellent presentation, but I'm sure he's up to the task. Alexander Thier is Director for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the United States Institute of Peace and Chair of the Institute's Afghan and Pakistan working groups. He leads USIP efforts in Afghanistan and Pakistan, where he's lived and worked on and off since 1983. He's co-author and editor of The Future of Afghanistan and was a member of the Afghan Study Group co-chaired by General James Jones and Ambassador Tom Pickering, in addition to co-authoring the group's final report. He's also a member of the Pakistan Policy Working Group and co-authored its 2008 report, The Next Chapter, United States and Pakistan. Before joining USIP in 2005, he was director of the Project on Failed States at Stanford University's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. From 2002 to 2004, he was legal advisor to Afghanistan's constitutional and judicial reform commissions in Kabul, where he assisted in the development of a new constitution and judicial system. He has a much longer bio that I'm going to only read a small portion of, but it's rather impressive. So Christina's given us lots to talk about as far as she's portrayed herself as a coin antagonist, I guess you could say.
Skeptic.
Sorry, skeptic.
Agnostic,
maybe. That's even better. She's not a fan, I think is what it comes down to. Alex, I know that you have spoken to me and said you've characterized the problem in Afghanistan as more one. Your position is more pro-stabilization, of which coin is an important part, but not essential. Perhaps you could talk a little bit in sort of response to Christina, but also why you think a counterinsurgency approach is the right approach for Afghanistan from a U.S. strategic standpoint, and why you think it has the possibility of succeeding.
Thanks. It's great to see everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here. Let me go back. I'll probably spend the first half of my remarks not sounding like I'm supporting it, but I think that it's very important for us all to think about why we're having this debate right now. There are obviously a lot of factors, new administration, and so on. But fundamentally, the reason that this debate has become so deep and important, both in Afghanistan and here at home, is because fundamentally we are all facing a crisis of confidence. We just hit the 8-year mark of Operation Enduring Freedom a couple of weeks ago. And we are looking at a mission where we have 100,000 troops on the ground at the moment. That's U.S. and international combined. We have spent, in American dollars alone, not including the military portion, somewhere upwards of committed to something like $60 billion. So we have made a significant investment. We have a mission that has some 41 troop-contributing nations. I think that you could probably call, at least in the post-Cold War era, that the Afghanistan mission is the most supported by the international community of any mission that we've seen. And even up to yesterday or the day before in the NATO capitals, we continue to have this voicing of support despite this crisis of confidence. But why is there such a crisis of confidence? Starting 8 years ago, the U.S. government, together with the Afghan government, promised the Afghan people essentially three things. They promised them security, a modicum of decent governance and justice, and some economic development. And when you look today on the ground at those three promises and what we've delivered, particularly in the areas that are most affected by the insurgency, we come up pretty severely wanting on all three. Afghans do not feel secure, and particularly in the southeast, the south, and the West, they feel insecure and increasingly insecure. We have polling data over the last several years that demonstrates that. The Taliban do not have to secure the population. What they do is that they demonstrate to the population that the Afghan government and the international community cannot protect them. They assassinate local officials, policemen, religious leaders, tribal leaders. They send night letters. They manage to scare people away from the polls. Essentially, they demonstrate to people that the Afghan government cannot and or will not protect them. When you look at the aid, the sorts of things that we've delivered to the Afghan people, we're building schools, the Taliban's burning them down. We're building roads, the Taliban's blowing them up and making them insecure to travel on. We try to build dams. They make it so insecure that we can't make serious infrastructure projects function. And that's not to say that we haven't actually delivered a tremendous amount. One of the costs of a crisis of confidence is that people tend to very heavily discount the present. They tend to very heavily discount the things that they see that have been delivered because what they're looking at is what's going to happen next. So they're not looking at whether a well was built in their village this year. They're looking at whether they're going to be able to access that well and whether we're going to be able to build on that success by providing electricity and so on in the next year. And one of the reasons that I think that point is so fundamental, because this idea of a crisis of confidence is that people are not just evaluating things for what they are. I mean, you look at the Afghan economy, it's actually grown pretty considerably in the last 8 years. But the trends that people look to, that they believe are most important, not only for their present but for their future, point negative. So you have this problem of the crisis of confidence. I lived in Afghanistan from 1993 to 1996, and I watched the Taliban take over Afghanistan the first time around. And we should be worried because a lot of the same things that allowed them to be so successful then are being repeated today. Did people in Kandahar in 1994 like the Taliban? Not particularly. They didn't like their ideology, and that's frankly not really what they led with. What they led with was law and order. What they led with was the idea that they would provide the minimum necessary security and law and order for people to be able to get on with their lives. And at the time, the warlords who divided the country and were engaging the civil war would not, could not provide that. We now, in some of those same areas, have the exact same problem. There is either a complete vacuum of power, or there is a government there that presents such an ugly face to the population because of corruption, because of engagement in narco-trafficking, because of stealing 1 million votes in the election, that people aren't willing to defend it. They're not evaluating the Afghan government of the Afghanistan Compact, of the 2004 Constitution, of the Bonn Agreement. They're evaluating the Afghan government that they see before them. And when you make that evaluation, the Taliban might not look like a great alternative, but they may look somewhat better. So we have this problem that the American public is skeptical that even if we have the right strategy that we can really pull it off. The Afghan public is skeptical, and meanwhile you have all of this essentially 4 years of momentum on the side of the insurgency. So let me go back to the beginning to address what Chris was talking about. All of that said, I do believe that the fundamental question is, first, do we have fundamental national security interests in Afghanistan? And that's where I start to differ somewhat with Chris's assessment, or at least the things that she emphasized. Let me make 3 brief points on this. The first is al-Qaeda. It is true that al-Qaeda is predominantly in Pakistan. Why are they in Pakistan today? They're in Pakistan today because we chased them out of Afghanistan. If anybody believes that if the Taliban are able to control a significant part of Afghan territory, that doesn't mean just go in and out in rage, but actually control major cities, major towns. If anybody believes that that doesn't mean that they would continue their association with al-Qaeda and provide a safe haven for al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, I'd like to see that evidence. We certainly have no proof that they will, but all signs, as the Magic 8 Ball says, point to yes. They did so in 1996. They began by providing a safe haven for the Taliban. In 2001, given the choice of regime destruction or handing over al-Qaeda, they chose regime destruction. And there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that they wouldn't still be. They are genetically and physically intertwined, financially intertwined with al-Qaeda. You look at people like Haqqani, whether you call him Taliban or not, he's one of the people who originally provided a home to al-Qaeda. In fact, because we're in the New America Foundation, I'll invoke Steve Cole, who I think says, who's studied al-Qaeda very intensively, that the idea that Yemen or Somalia provide an equally good place, and that if we secure these places, they'll just run somewhere else, does not accord with history. The Taliban and al-Qaeda are intermarried. They train together, they raise funds together, they recruit together. This has now slipped into Pakistan. And so making this distinction between Afghanistan and Pakistan, I think, is a foolhardy distinction. Because the truth is the insurgents don't recognize the border. And if we recognize it in our analysis and suddenly believe that a Taliban controlled at least part of Afghanistan would be unfriendly to al-Qaeda, I think that's problematic. So it's not to say that al-Qaeda come back to Afghanistan in some form, have some training at camps, something like that, and America gets attacked. It's a probability game. The question is, if al-Qaeda has a stronger safe haven than it does now within Afghanistan, does that endanger us further? And it seems to me the answer is clear. But I actually think an even more compelling interest is regional stability with an emphasis on Pakistan. Pakistan, as we all know, nation of 170 million Muslims, 50 to 80 nuclear weapons. They have fought 3 wars with their, well, depends on how you count them, but 3+ wars with their neighbor India. Many people believe, I don't have access to the intelligence, but people who've reported on it suggest that in 1999, the Kargil crisis was the closest that we've come potentially to a nuclear exchange since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The distance between Kargil and Mumbai is not great in the sense that the Mumbai attack, although I believe that the Indians have shown considerable restraint, I don't think that they're likely to do so. Given that we know that there are anti-Indian militants operating within Pakistan that are interested in conducting such an attack again, I think that minimizing the potential for not only the destabilization of the Pakistani regime itself, which is a grave concern, but also the destabilization of the relationship between India and Pakistan, while there's so much out-of-control militancy in Pakistan, is also quite a grave risk. And then that doesn't also account for Taliban or other associated movements moving into Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Western China, and so on. I believe that the United States has great interests in the region. And so the question that it ultimately comes to then is it possible for us to secure those interests through a more robust strategy than a counterterrorism strategy? Can we actually be engaged in a stabilization strategy that will succeed in Afghanistan? And that by far, I think, is the most difficult question to answer. I come out on the side that, I believe when you look at Afghanistan over the last 8 years, it is very difficult to disentangle what's impossible about Afghanistan with what was terrible about our strategy in Afghanistan. Because we made massive errors all along the way. And in some ways that's water under the bridge, but in some ways, hopefully, some of those things may still be correctable. I think that the gravest error that we made was not in the troop numbers or how we fought the insurgency or the counterterrorism battle, but it was in fact how we dealt with the Afghans and indeed what Afghan leadership looked like. We essentially, in beginning of 2001, turned over leadership of Afghanistan. This was the initial problem with the police that we've never been able to overcome. That essentially we worried about terrorism and counterterrorism, and we turned Afghanistan back over to these proxy armies, precisely the same people who had so undermined any level of support that the Afghan population would have had that they welcomed the Taliban in their stead. We brought all of these people back and gave them the keys to the palace. They became ministers, they became governors, they appointed police chiefs, they took over state-owned enterprises, and they created a culture of impunity in the country, which I believe is the primary reason why the insurgency has been so successful. Not that they became so clever or they learned so many things from Iraq, which is true, but they went back to Afghanistan in 2004 and 2005 and saw that there was a vacuum of power and that people were not supporting or not willing to risk their lives for the Afghan government that had been created. So that is our greatest concern. And in many ways our greatest enemy in Afghanistan. So the question is, can we continue to successfully engage and address that problem? And I give a qualified yes. And the reason I give a qualified yes, and I'm willing to support that strategy, is because I believe that the other outcomes, the other alternatives are so truly grim and unpredictable. I often say that I think the only law that rules Afghanistan is the law of unintended consequences. When you look at the danger of turning Afghanistan either back over to civil war, which I think any significant withdrawal would have, potential Taliban takeover of part of the country with the attendant destabilization of the region, I think that those consequences are so grim and grave for us, not to mention all of the thousands of Afghans that we've worked with to educate, female parliamentarians that we've gotten elected in the last year, girls' schools that we've built. All of this will go up in a puff of smoke, and we will stand by and watch that because of these concerns, I think very rational concerns that Chris raises, that we may not be able to get the job done. But still, all of that said, I think we need to try. And so I'm not going to elaborate because I see that my time is up, but I'm just going to make 4 brief points that hopefully we can come back to in the question and answer of how I think we do that. The first is radical prioritization. We have been doing too many things poorly in Afghanistan instead of a few things well. If there's ever a time, it is triage time in Afghanistan. And we need to figure out a few key things. I believe those are security, justice, and a modicum of economic development, focusing almost exclusively on agriculture, that we need to be doing now in order to make a difference. The second is that point of addressing the culture of impunity and improving governance. I think that this is the most important thing that we need to do, more than troop numbers. And this comes from both working with Karzai, assuming that he's elected in the next election, and working around Karzai. Working with Karzai means getting better people in office, getting better governors, and putting a lot more pressure than we've put on him previously to do the right thing where it counts. The other side of that is my third point, which is decentralize. Everything that succeeds in Afghanistan, if you look at the most successful programs, whether it's public health, whether it's what's known as the National Solidarity Program with block grants to communities, all the programs that have succeeded the most are programs that fundamentally rely on existing Afghan capacity at the community level to get things done. But that has not primarily been the focus of our efforts, either in governance, in dispute resolution, or in development. We need to focus a lot more at the community level because that's where most Afghans live, and that's where you can actually effectively make a difference. And then the final one, of course, is us, improving international coordination and effectiveness. You've all heard the horror stories of, how many cents on the dollar make it their way to Afghanistan, contracting, subcontracting, our own problems with corruption, and our problems with ineptitude. You look at the question of the civilian surge. Great idea in theory. In practice, do we have enough people who are well-trained, who will stay in the area long enough that we can put down at the local level to actually make a difference? And all of this ultimately, to me, gets wrapped up back into this theme of Afghan leadership. So I think Chris and I agree on the assessment. We need fundamentally Afghan leadership. The question is, can we still get it? And I believe particularly if we focus at the subnational level, we focus at actors other than just the president, and we apply a much more rigorous approach to accountability than we have previously, then we can make enough of a difference to make this strategy the best way forward.
Well, I was right when I suggested that Alex would be more than up to the task of responding to Chris Fair. That was an excellent presentation. Our final participant today is Jonathan Landy, who is the Senior National Security Intelligence Correspondent for McClatchy Newspapers. And he's written about foreign affairs and U.S. defense, intelligence, and foreign policies for only 25 years. I think all of us who have followed the current military operations in Afghanistan as well as in Iraq are indebted to Jonathan for his extraordinary courage and journalistic chops he's shown in both theaters. From 1985 to 1990, he covered South Asia, including the final 4 years of the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, the conflicts in Punjab, Kashmir, and Sri Lanka. In 1989, cracked down pro-democracy demonstrations in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. From 1990 to 1994, he covered the collapse and wars of former Yugoslavia for UPI and then for Christian Science Monitor. And, of course, he covered the 2001 U.S.-led intervention in Afghanistan, including the Battle of Tora Bor 2003. He spent 4 months in northern Iraq covering preparations for the U.S.-led invasion and the invasion itself. And he returns frequently to report in Afghanistan and Pakistan. He's been nominated 3 times for Pulitzer Prize for his investigative work on the Bush administration's use of exaggerated pre-war intelligence in Iraq and the lack of post-invasion stability operations planning. And again, he has a much longer resume, but I'll leave it to that for now. Jonathan, I want to pick up a little bit on some of the points that Alex was talking about as far as one point you made to me was that the focus sometimes is a little too much on Al-Qaeda and not enough on the Taliban and some of the larger regional issues. And I'm wondering if you could, there seems to be, for obvious reasons, a fixation on Al-Qaeda's position in Afghanistan as well as in Pakistan. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the Taliban and this question of stabilization as well as some of the larger regional issues that play in that.
Thank you very much for having me here. Appreciate it. I just came from a speech by Senator Kerry who talked about the need to reframe the debate. And I think Senator Kerry was right. I don't think he went far enough, with all due respect, in talking about the stakes that the United States, its allies, the world, the region and the world have in failure in Afghanistan. And I say failure because, and not defeat, because we have 100,000, we and our allies have 100,000 troops there, and we're failing. We're not being defeated. And I just came back from 7 weeks in Afghanistan to this debate that's going on about the new strategy. And I'm astounded by what I find to be this very superficial, misguided, and dangerously naive debate about the stakes in Afghanistan because of this single-minded focus on Al-Qaeda, and if the Taliban come back, will there be an increased threat to the homeland or not? And I understand that this is being driven by essentially domestic politics and next year's election. And I think that it does a huge disservice to the American public. Now, if you're looking for policy prescription from me as a journalist, I'm not going to give one because everyone knows journalists don't have opinions. But let me talk about why I think this is a dangerous and misguided and debate, and why it does a massive disservice to the country and its allies and the region and the world. Because what we're watching right now is the gravest crisis that region has been embroiled in, I think, since essentially I've been covering, except since I've been covering it. When you take Afghanistan and Pakistan together, and hence this short-sighted focus on Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is important. There's no doubt about it. But I submit that the stakes for the United States and its allies and Afghanistan itself and Pakistan and the region as a whole in the world are far greater than just a terrorist network, which is badly damaged and whose threat has been blown way out of proportion, first by the Bush administration, and I'm afraid by the Obama administration and the Congress and the military. And we can talk about that if you want. But the way I like to look at this situation is as a series of concentric circles, beginning with Afghanistan. And what we're really talking about, the stakes we're talking about, are the future security and stability of South and Central Asia, the status of the United States globally, and indeed the future viability of the NATO alliance. Because let's not forget, if there's failure in Afghanistan, what does NATO mean anymore? Let's start with the first of my concentric circles, and Alex touched on some of this, and we're talking about failure in Afghanistan, a precipitous U.S. withdrawal will mean a reignition of the ethnic war that was essentially stilled. It's a civil war, but it fought mostly along ethnic lines, that was essentially stilled by the 2001 invasion. And what we're talking about is a civil war that would put into question the very viability of Afghanistan as a multi-ethnic state. Essentially, the country is divided already between the war-torn Pashtun-dominated areas in the south and the east and the north, parts of the north, because as it was pointed out by Christine, there are 3 provinces in the north which are now, large parts of which are now controlled by the Taliban, because everybody took their eyes off the ball thinking, well, the north is all minorities, forgetting the fact that there are very, very large Pashtun belts, Pashtun areas in Baghlan, Baglis and Kunduz provinces. And I actually went up there on this last trip because during the election, on election day, when I was there to cover the election, the worst of the violence that we knew about on that day, and of course there was probably a lot worse in other places, was actually in Baghlan province. And I'm thinking, what was that all about? The fact is that the infiltration of the Taliban into those provinces have greatly increased ethnic tensions, as has the election. Let's not forget that this election has largely been fought along ethnic lines. Ethnic tensions have not really gone away since 2001, given the fact that the Northern Alliance, or those who used to belong to the Northern Alliance, are essentially are in the parliamentary opposition, such that it is, and have never forgiven either the United States or President Karzai over what they perceive as being not getting their lion's share of what was due to them, because they were the ones who, quote unquote, liberated Kabul and liberated the country from the Taliban. Those feelings have not gone away. In fact, they've been exacerbated, I believe, by the continuing war, the inability that they see of the Pashtuns to make peace, the election, as I said, as particularly the rigging. And I found one of the most alarming things that I found on my last trip was the degree to which ethnic tensions pervade the middle and upper level of the military command, which, don't forget, to a large part is very much still controlled by the so-called Panchiri Mafia. I spent some time with some of these officers, and in one very telling case, I was interviewing a Panchiri officer. He's a colonel, a commander of one of the largest Afghan, it's known as a Kandak. I guess it's the equivalent of one of our brigades. Battalions. And I noticed, first of all, that there was no picture of his commander-in-chief in his office, but there was a picture of Ahmad Shah Massoud. I also then we started talking about the conditions in the Army, and I got this earful on the record, and you should have seen the Marine major who was sitting with us cringing increasingly as this interview went on. As this colonel started talking about the corruption within the Ministry of Defense, how he wasn't getting the food, the money he needs to feed his troops, because, by the way, to make Afghans more efficient, more self-sufficient, the United States 3 years ago stopped contracting to feed the Afghan army, and the Afghan army now gets money from Kabul to feed its troops in the field. And he was complaining that they're not getting the army the money, and in fact had to make a trip to Kabul to find out where their money was, and undoubtedly it was being siphoned off by people in the Ministry of Defense. And from there, we got onto the subject of the election, whereupon I got an earful about how, and this is from a colonel in the Afghan army, how we need to sweep the entire lot out of office. We just have to get rid of every single one of them. And a similar comment by a colonel in the American Army would result in sedition charges under the Unified Code of Military Justice. As I said, I think that the election and the fraud, the industrial strength fraud that was committed on behalf of President Karzai has greatly exacerbated the ethnic tensions. And even if there's a successful second round, I think essentially what will happen is you will have an opposition that will remain largely based on minorities, around the minorities, led by Abdullah. And that does not augur well for tamping down these tensions. Let's go to the next of my concentric circles. If indeed there is a new civil war in Afghanistan, we already have parts of the Pakistani military and intelligence establishment backing the Taliban. I submit that there's a grave danger, and I'm saying any of this is going to happen, but these are things that need to be included in our debate, in the public debate, about the stakes in Afghanistan, and that are not being talked about by either the military, by the White House, by the Congress. And in fact, it's really the responsibility of the President of the United States to frame the contours of this debate, and it's not being done. Perhaps he will do it once he announces the strategy. But my next concentric circle, as I said, is you already have Pakistan being the traditional patron of the Pashtuns. I submit that you might end up, there's a danger of having the Indians back the other side of this civil war, the minorities in this civil war, because let's not forget, prior to 2001, or prior to the U.S. intervention, that's exactly what was going on. And not only that, the Russians and the Iranians were providing covert assistance to the Northern Alliance as well, because they don't want the Taliban sitting on their border. The border of Central Asia or the border of Iran. But in the case of the Indians, I don't think that any Indian government could possibly survive politically if another Mumbai happens, and if that Mumbai is carried out by Punjabi, not Pashtun, but Pakistani Punjabi extremists. And let's not forget, and Christine is an expert on this, the depth to which there is extremism in southern Punjab that is totally unattended by the Pakistani government. What if those people were to have been trained and to have had sanctuary in a Taliban-run Afghanistan? There's no way that an Indian government can allow that to happen. And therefore, I think that there's a grave danger of a proxy war resulting, if there is a return to civil war in Afghanistan, between nuclear-armed Pakistan and nuclear-armed India. This is a real serious consideration that's not getting any kind of airtime here in Washington that I can tell. You know all the tensions that already exist between India and Pakistan over Afghanistan. India has 18 consulates. India is arming the Baluch separatists on the Pakistani side of the Baluch border. India, the United States, Afghanistan, Israel, the Europeans, and anyone else you want to throw in there are involved in an anti-Pakistan conspiracy to surround and destabilize Pakistan. And this is not coming from fringe writers in Pakistan on the right. This is coming from senior Pakistani officials that I have talked to and members of the so-called Pakistani intelligentsia. And they're serious about this. The Indians are hugely invested in Pakistan, not only from the roads, but $1.3 billion worth of aid they have pledged to the Karzai government. There's a reason why the Indian embassy has been bombed twice in Kabul. Let me get to my next concentric. So let's not forget that the Indians also have renovated an air base in Tajikistan, which has added to these tensions from the Pakistani perspective. I talked about the danger of Punjabi extremists launching another Punjabi extremists who received sanctuary in a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan doing another Mumbai. Well, let's not forget about the Kashmiris either. And let's not forget who was killed when President Clinton fired cruise missiles off at Afghanistan at the so-called al-Qaeda camp. He killed Kashmiris. And so if there's a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, you will have a geographically contiguous corridor running from Afghanistan through Pakistan into Indian Kashmir. We can't forget that possibility and what the potential danger of that is as well. Moving along, because I know I'm running out of time. Within that same concentric circle, we're engaged in this debate about what would happen if the Taliban came back to power. They wouldn't be engaged in destabilization outside of Afghanistan or exporting jihadism versus they would. Well, we all tend to forget that in 1994, Mullah Omar went to the mosque in Kandahar, the mosque of the Cloak of the Prophet, and became only the second man in Afghan history to don the Cloak of the Prophet, essentially having himself declared the Prophet's successor. He was declared the defender of the faithful. And I submit that this is a man, first of all, who was involved in defeating the Soviets. If he is involved in defeating the Jews and the Crusaders, do we have a situation where Muslims around the world will see him as the new Mahdi? I don't know, but it's not something we're talking about. The fact is that bin Laden has never sought that role for himself, and both he and his deputy, Ayman Zawahiri, have sworn bayat, or religious oath, to Mullah Omar. Finally, two quick points. We talked about Baghlan and Kunduz. In all modesty, I was the reporter who broke that story. And as part of the story, what I was told was there are Chechens, Arabs, Uzbeks, and Germans, thank you, and Arabs who are up in Baghlan, up in Kunduz with the Taliban, and their target is not Afghanistan, but across the border in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, where lately there has been a rise in violence pitting the governments against Islamists. And the fact is, for the last 20 years, the dictatorial regimes of those Central Asian republics have done nothing but brutally repress moderate Islam. These countries have the same youth bulge that we see in other parts of the region, and if you've suppressed moderate Islam, I submit that there's a very grave danger that you've got, that they're ripe for extremist Islam. And finally, and I'll leave it at this, the loss of U.S. prestige in a failure in Afghanistan to the benefit of Iran and competitors like China and Russia. And finally, as I mentioned, the effective neutering of NATO. NATO will exist at that point, having failed in its first major combat operation as an alliance. Why would anybody bank on NATO's effectiveness following something like this? And I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you very much. That was another great presentation there. So I want to pick on one point that all of you basically raised. I think we can all agree that going forward, we're not going to see a precipitous withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. We're probably not going to see 80,000 more troops going in either. So the question is sort of trying to figure out what that middle ground is. And one point that Alex made was about prioritization. You talked about prioritizing economic development and governance. What about regional prioritization? I mean, one of the points that comes across here is that that the Taliban are making serious inroads into the north and west of the country, and that's, I think we can all agree, that's a place where probably Taliban have a weaker from a public relations standpoint than they do in the south and the east. So should the U.S. approach be to focus more, considering the constraints, political constraints, as well as resource constraints, focus more on pacifying the northern part of the country, parts where Taliban are making inroads, and reduce the military footprint in the south? Is that kind of a containment strategy one that is realistic and one that might actually work? And I guess all of you can sort of comment on that.
This goes back to Pakistan. And to be clear, it's really interesting. I actually find that we don't disagree, really. I'm just saying, what the heck is Plan B after these lovely Plan A's may not pale out? But I go back to Pakistan. We have a reality that while they are going after the Pakistan Taliban, which targets it is not going after the Afghan Taliban. And the U.S. government, despite $13+ billion, has been unable to persuade it to go after the Afghan Taliban. Many of the folks, the other ethnicity that you left out in the Kunduz litany of horrors, is the presence of Pakistanis. In fact, the first suicide bombing attempt was in 2007, and it was perpetrated by a few Pakistanis that when they wired their vehicle bomb, got the vehicle to no longer start, and they were caught pushing the vehicle to target. So you have to love the dedication. But the same thing is true in the South. So again, I go back to the regional. We can't do everything. I mean, no matter how much we'd like to do everything, the reality is we can't, because but go back to the Northern Alliance, and I want to tie this back to the regional picture. You both talked about the Northern Alliance, and I'm going to add a third layer to this. In fact, the Indians, and they're very proud of this. For whatever, rightly or wrongly, they're very proud of the fact that they kept the Northern Alliance alive. And in fact, the air base at Fokkar Aini in Tajikistan was there during the Taliban period. And a number of Indian journalists have written about this. So when we brought the Northern Alliance back, not only was it very deleterious for the Afghans, because these are the same thugs that had been so reviled, and the reason why the Afghans tolerated the Taliban, but we also said to the Pakistanis, we're handing the keys to the Indians. And I think that's a really important regional point that I don't think was appreciated in 2001, because I don't think we understood that the Pakistanis understood the Northern Alliance to be a proxy of India in the same way that we clearly understood the Taliban to be a proxy for Pakistan. So going back to prioritization, and just, I'm a Libra, so, I've got a justice fetish. I have real issues with the Pakistan policy. Now, it is true that if you manage to seal off that some fictitious method of of keeping the Pakistanis from moving back and forth, the internal situation in Afghanistan itself is sufficiently horrible to sustain insurgency. But it's also true that Mullah Omar, Haqqani, Hekmatyar remain assets of the Pakistani state. And so for me, it really is deeply ironic that in Pakistan, by the way, Pakistan, all of those things that you laid out, what if, has already happened. Lashkar-e-Taiba did train in Afghanistan during the Taliban. Harkatul Jihadi Islam, the militants that were killed during the missile strike, were actually Punjabi, although it was a group arguably fighting in the name of Kashmir. So this has already happened. We already have 6 decades of Pakistan demonstrably supporting militancy, and the United States demonstrably having no ability to do anything about it. So I also think about regional prioritization. And I think as a regional prioritization, given that Pakistan is the revisionist state, that every war, with the possible exception of 1971 with India, Pakistan started, and that Pakistan has used militancy as a tool of foreign policy to project its interests throughout the region, I think we really have to take a hard look. How can we persuade, cajole, compel, whatever your preferred moniker is, for making Pakistan cease what it's doing and what it finds advantageous to do when we need it to sustain an increased presence of troops in Afghanistan. And I also think there's a fake binary between hauling up and going home and sending in 80,000. That's a total fake binary. We can, in fact, in the interim, increase the troops but change what they do. So put them on a training mission so they're not out there killing civilians. So, but my bottom line is, no matter what happens in Afghanistan, we have a problem with Pakistan, and Afghanistan is not going to solve it. Why is that? Because the Pakistanis see value in these groups. So without radically changing Pakistan's cost-benefit analysis with new carrots, which are probably politically infeasible, for example, a very rigorous criteria-based nuclear deal. I mean, you can imagine, that's politically a nightmare. But without totally restructuring the kinds of carrots that we offer to Pakistan, as well as the sticks that we're willing to impose, and there's no evidence that we actually have the fortitude to impose sticks, what do we do about Pakistan? And so for me, I just find that AF-PAC is really inverted. It should be PAC in capital letters -AF.
I think that Christine kind of hits it on the nail on the head. Let me throw one more factor out there. We all focus on how, when we look at how Afghanistan has gone so wrong, we focus on, basically on Iraq. Let me throw another factor out there, and that's called the Indo-U.S. nuclear deal. I submit that this was one of the gravest strategic blunders that the Bush administration made when it comes to Afghanistan. Why? Because they essentially did a deal with Pakistan's sworn enemy, and they began the talks in 04, 05. When did the Taliban resurgence start? 04, 05. Is there a connection there? I think there probably was. Why? Because that deal told the Pakistani military command and intelligence that the United States' strategic goals in that region and Pakistani strategic goals in that region don't converge, even though the Bush administration declared Pakistan a major non-U.S. ally. I don't believe that the Pakistanis see their strategic interests in Afghanistan as the same as the United States. Every time the administration talks about, well, we've got a 12 to 18-month window, the Pakistanis who are officials who are patronizing these groups look at their watches and their calendars and say, yep, we can do that. That is a hole, by the way, in General General McChrystal's strategy, at least the unclassified version, that you can drive a truck through. I mean, there's no way to resolve the war in Afghanistan. There's no way to resolve the war in Afghanistan as long as Pakistan continues to see its strategic interests differing from that of the United States. And when you hear Pakistani officials talk about encirclement by the United States, Afghanistan, India, Israel, the Europeans, to destabilize their country, as illogical as it sounds, they're serious. So I think you have to start somehow with reassuring, trying to get the Pakistanis to switch to get off that mantra, to try and figure out how do you make this how do you get this within, make this part of the Pakistanis' interest? How do you see them as seeing a resolution in Afghanistan in their interest? And I don't know how you do that, quite frankly. I think also the fact that the administration has sabotaged itself where it comes to India right at the very beginning, poisoned that well. I mean, Mr. Holbrooke has tried to go to India twice, and twice they've turned him down. I don't know how you get a resolution to that situation without Indian input. And therefore, I would sit back and try and figure out how do we make that correct that very grave misstep that was made at the very beginning of this administration, mentioning the K word, and that's Kashmir, obviously.
Coming back to the question you asked, I think, internally in Afghanistan about a varied regional strategy, I think that there was just really a tragic error in the first few years of the mission. I mean, there was a lot of low-hanging fruit in central, northern, even parts of eastern Afghanistan. I mean, you look at the maps that Chris was talking about, the UN maps and the sort of creeping red tide of Taliban instability that has spread itself across the map. And the reality is that a lot of the areas that are red today, of course, were not only not red 2, 3, 4 years ago, but in fact they were solidly pro-government and certainly not pro-Taliban. And so, but I think that there's a, if that's the red ink spot creeping across the map, I do definitely think that there is an opportunity for a blue or whatever green color ink spot. If you look at how we are prioritizing our aid, it's been a problem for the last couple of years and is only increasing, that more and more of our aid is going into something, 24 districts in the South and in the East, where we're trying to have the greatest amount of difference, where it's going to be most difficult to do that. And the reality is that Afghans do pay attention to what's happening in other parts of the country. They travel there, they trade, and I really believe strongly that demonstrating success in areas that are solidly still pro-government, if that's the right term, or at least anti-Taliban, and those areas that are sort of on the border, in some ways are probably the areas that we should be concentrating most heavily, because A, we can make a difference, we can continue to go there, and you actually have people on the ground who are able to try and be the ones who grab hold of that strategy and implement it.
I think we'll open it up now. About 15, 20 minutes left to Q&A. We have somebody with a microphone, so we can start back here. And if you could, before you start, this is important, David, please make sure your question is actually phrased as a question and not a statement, essay, or what have you.
Would never do that, Mr. Cohen. My name is Edward Joseph with the Helsinki Commission. Congratulations on assembling this outstanding panel. I can't think of 3 people who I'd rather learn from than Alex, Jonathan, and Chris. If I was listening carefully, I heard Alex and Jonathan lay out the gravest possible risks. And Chris, you may or may not share that assessment of the risk, but raise skepticism as to whether this counterinsurgency policy would work. When, as far as my understanding, and you and others put the emphasis on Pakistan, my understanding of the Pakistani message to Washington with respect to Afghanistan is, please don't leave prematurely. Whatever you do, finish the job. That's perhaps not the message you get, but that's what I understand. And as you say, they see value in extremists, and obviously if the Taliban were to increase, that value, of course, would increase. My question really directed to Chris, but Alex and Jonathan, feel free to jump in. Chris, your skepticism is grounded on that the government in Afghanistan is, as you put the word, indefensible. Put it into regional context. How defensible or how wonderful is the Pakistan delivery of democracy? What about the deal in SWAT on justice? Why do people send their kids to madrasas in Pakistan? In other words, maybe it may just be that improving the governance in Afghanistan may not be so unattainable, and if so, would you think that maybe Plan A is worth backing? Thank you, Mr. Cohen.
No, I have we don't disagree in the threat assessment. All I'm saying is, whatever Plan A we settle on, we need a Plan B, and that Plan B basically asks the question: what if COIN fails? What are our supreme national security interests, and how do we secure them? So I actually, oddly enough, I don't disagree with them. But I'm looking 5 years out, 10 years out, and what Alex has put on the table hasn't worked. How do we secure our interests? I'm also not advocating that Pakistan has done anything that we've asked it to do. Actually, far from it. And as a taxpayer, I find it very frustrating that we've paid them $13 billion to help the war on terrorism while precisely undermining the same. So my argument is actually a little bit different. I need to sort of dance around this for some reasons that are obvious. We need a strategy that affects Pakistan's cost-benefit calculus so that it finds it disadvantageous to support the Taliban, disadvantageous to support the Lashkar-e-Taiba and other groups. So that's not saying that I think the Pakistan government is the best that we could possibly hope for. Far from it. I'm actually arguing for a space for compellence. Now, I want to go back to the premise that you initially laid out, that Pakistan keeps saying, don't leave, don't leave, don't leave. Well, the Pakistanis have a very curious history of saying a lot of things, like, for example, we didn't proliferate. We didn't deliberately send troops up to Kargil. No AQ Khan's a non-state actor. My experience has been that the Pakistanis know precisely how to say what we want to say. And it is the cupidity of Washington that we keep getting suckered and writing the checks. Now, it is absolutely true that all else equal, the Pakistanis fear our departure, because finally the Pakistanis realize they have a very serious internal security mess. However, they have not realized that they need to thoroughly embrace COIN, counterinsurgency, because they prefer to maintain their conventional orientation, because that is the modus vivendi of the Pakistan army. That's what allows it to do whatever the heck it wants to do domestically, because it is endowed with more powers than any other institution, because it's justifying its existence on the basis of protecting against India. So for Pakistan to recognize that its biggest threat's internal, that India, in fact, if Pakistan just stopped supporting terrorism, wouldn't care about it, is an enormous problem. So it's true that the Pakistanis worry about what happens in Afghanistan. It is also true that the Pakistanis do not want a stable Afghanistan if that Afghanistan follows the trajectory that it's currently following, which is one of greater alignment towards India. Now, very interestingly, the U.S., India, and Iran share, and this is the point that you talked on, Jonathan, shares a lot more in common in terms of how we want Afghanistan to shape up than Pakistan does. So I would simply encourage you to take what the Pakistanis say about please don't leave with a grain of salt. There is, by the way, one other argument why they don't want us to leave, and that comes to this. Have you noticed how few trucks get blown up as they pass from Torkham to Bagram? The trucks that move from Chuman to Kandahar in the middle of Talibanistan don't get blown up. And do you know why that is? Because a lot of people are making a lot of money of our logistical throughput. So I am absolutely certain they don't want us to leave anytime soon. But I'm absolutely certain that they really don't want us to stabilize an Afghanistan that is thoroughly allied to India.
I think I'd slightly disagree with that. I would say which Pakistanis are we talking about?
Is the army.
Which ones are we talking about? Because a lot of the people who set public opinion in Pakistan are actually saying there's a school there of thought that says actually we could have it a lot easier here in Pakistan. We could deal with our problems if the Americans got out of Afghanistan, because that's why we have the problems we have here today. In fact, all those Taliban from Afghanistan, they come here and cause all this problem because the Americans are there. And if the Americans were to leave, that would be the end of it. And I think that that's probably wishful thinking, obviously, on their part, simply because they don't want. A lot of Pakistanis don't want to acknowledge that that they're primary cause of what's going on. And again, as I said, which Pakistanis are we talking about? I'm really concerned about what I believe is actually a major split that's getting wider and wider and wider within the Pakistani establishment, obviously led by the military and the ISI. They need to have this instability for another reason, and that is if they didn't have external jihads where they could send all of these groups that they themselves had created, I don't know how long Pakistan would be able to survive. Certainly you're seeing the blowback now from, we've been seeing the blowback from the creation of these groups, not just the groups that went and fought in Afghanistan, but those that have been fighting in Kashmir. And those groups are now actually fighting in Afghanistan because they're not sending them to Kashmir. There's evidence the Marines have been fighting Punjabis in Helmand province. Some people told me that an ambush I got caught in while I was there this last time in Kunar province was Lashkar-e-Taiba. If that's true, then that's a whole new level of Pakistani.
It is true. They've been there for a while in Kunar.
Well, that in and of itself would represent a whole new escalation in Pakistani intervention in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, you have this. I would submit that operations, terrorist attacks like what happened the other day last couple of weeks ago in the general headquarters in Rawalpindi, the Pakistani Pentagon, and other attacks we've seen lately are actually a result of inside jobs. There's obviously really serious infiltration that's taken place inside the Pakistani military. So all of this really complicates any kind of approach that the United States might try and formulate to deal with this problem.
Let me just make one point that builds on what these guys are saying, and I know that they both talk about these things, but it's so important to understand the perceptions game in the region because it's so maniacal and complex. If you talk to President Hamid Karzai, for instance, recently said in a press interview, although I believe not naming the country in the press interview, that certain foreign entities in Afghanistan with military forces were helicoptering Taliban up to Kunduz province. This is on the back of a fairly widespread Afghan perception that the United States is supporting the Taliban. Why do they support the Taliban? Well, there's a couple of different reasons why, but one of the arguments, of course, always is that the Pakistanis are supporting the Taliban, we're supporting the Pakistanis, therefore we're supporting the Taliban, which itself is a pretty good logical stream. But then it gets, of course, more complex, which I think is even more of a Pakistani disease than it is an Afghan disease, which is that they don't trust the reasons that we say we're there. And I only have to add to that by saying that apparently something like 30% of Americans believe in MyHop and LIHOP. MyHop is made it happen on purpose, LIHOP is let it happen on purpose, and that refers to 9/11. 30% of the American public believes that the American government either made 9/11 happen or allowed it to happen on purpose. Probably half of those who believe in UFOs. But the point is that's the American public. If you apply that to Pakistan and Afghanistan, where these people have been mushrooms in the information age, in other words, kept in the dark and had shit shoveled on top of them by their own governments for decades, you have no reason to believe official propaganda by your government about what you're doing. And so it's so important to believe not that people are somehow irrational actors, but that the information sources that they believe that they can rely on are so difficult to trust for them that they don't honestly believe that they know what's going on and why we're there and why others are there. And this fundamentally confounds our ability to be there and even do well-intentioned work even if we're not doing it very well.
Hi, I'm Bob Dreyfus with The Nation magazine. I hate it when you all agree on things. But one of the things you agreed on that I hate is that you don't seem to question at all the notion that the threat is maybe far less than it appears either from al-Qaeda or the Taliban. I mean, Alex, you said that al-Qaeda has been, or I guess, John, you said that, one of you said that al-Qaeda has been wildly exaggerated by the Bush administration, and same with Obama. I couldn't agree more, and they haven't attacked anybody for 4 or 5 years anywhere except in their theater, pretty much. Most of their leaders have been blown up. They're on the run or hiding. So I don't see the big threat from al-Qaeda either in Pakistan or if they come back to some cave in Afghanistan. And the Taliban has never attacked anybody. The idea that Mullah Omar could become a guru of world Muslims is absurd. People despise him and think he's a crazed person. So, except for obviously, some extreme faction, 1% of 1%. So I don't see the threat, and I think we're really being led down by a garden path, in part by all of you, but also by the administration, thinking that this is some drastic national security problem, when in fact the Taliban is under Pakistan's thumb. So COIN, I mean, it's like thinking that we could defeat the Viet Cong in South Vietnam while North Vietnam sat idly by. I mean, Pakistan is the problem. And until we figure out that problem, this whole other thing really is moot. And I think we're not being told the truth at all by the administration.
Okay.
Well, I don't entirely disagree with you, which is partly why I asked the question, how do we secure our CT interests even if coin eventually fails? But I have a somewhat different view from you as well. If you look at the European conspiracies, the vast majority of the conspiracies that have been disrupted have actually moved through Pakistan. And there's a very interesting nexus going on with these southern Punjab groups, these Kashmiri groups. You don't find yourself going from some suburb of London to Vanna. You actually go to Vanna via these southern Punjab groups. Similarly, these southern Punjab groups are the one that lends the suicide bombers to the TTP. Yet Pakistan continues to draw little circles around the bad guys while letting this other raft of militants run around with impunity. So what I'm suggesting is that we actually have a new kind of threat. Incidentally, the interesting thing about the current situation of Afghanistan is that it resembles what happened in the 80s. You have Americans that are going to Afghanistan. You have Germans going to Afghanistan, and they are eventually going to come home in the same way in which the foreign fighters eventually came home when they left in the 80s. So it is true the Taliban haven't targeted us, but this is sort of supply and demand. So conditioned upon there being a supply of radicalized individuals that want to become tested in the crucible of jihad, that crucible right now is Pakistan and it's Afghanistan. And that's my concern, is that we have this new generation of militants who radicalize in country A, who go to Afghanistan or Pakistan and go to their home country or another country altogether and operate. And we collectively as an international community don't seem to have the resources to capture these characters once they leave. So I don't entirely disagree with you, which is why I'm somewhat skeptical myself about Al-Qaeda. However, Al-Qaeda, you don't have necessarily to have a sanctuary. If Al-Qaeda is the one that's funding these operations, if Al-Qaeda is an organization that's underwriting the training institutions where these folks from Germany or from the UK come and get this training. So I would actually argue, going back again to my Pakistan argument, that this is the place where it's the finishing school for international jihadist aspirants. And our inability to put pressure on Pakistan to not just go after the Pakistan Taliban, to go after all of these groups comprehensively, we definitely have a security threat. We had a security threat here in Virginia with the Lashkar-e-Taiba paintball. Initially, I thought it was kind of an amusing story. But the more we learn about it, we learn far from amusing. It was outright terrifying. You had converts going to a Lashkar-e-Taiba camp to come back here. I mean, so we have to remember that we are living in, jihad is globalized. It's not just hanging out in Vanna. And I think we have to remember that. And that's why this region does continue to pose supreme national security interest, not only to us, but also to our allies.
Let me talk about, when I talked about the Al-Qaeda threat being vastly overblown, Al-Qaeda was painted by the Bush administration and to a certain extent this administration as an existential threat to the United States. It's not an existential threat to the United States. There is a chance perhaps at some point down the road that maybe or maybe not, they'll get a nuclear weapon or try and get a dirty bomb. But they don't pose an existential threat to the United States. I mean, they've been portrayed by the previous administration as the equivalent of the Soviet nuclear arsenal, and they're not. The point being about Mullah Omar is the fact that we don't know what will happen if he returns to Kandahar and puts the cloak of the prophet on again. He may not personally start exporting jihad, but under the way he's operated in the past and Pashtunwali and the culture that prevails in that part of the world, he's not going to kick these people out of Afghanistan. He's going to allow them to proliferate. He's going to allow them sanctuary. And we're talking about providing them, these other people, with space. As Christina talks about, space that they now have in Pakistan, expanded into Afghanistan to export jihad northwards. They're already up in the north. These guys are already there. And back into Pakistan, across into India, perhaps the Gulf. My point being that we don't know what will happen. We need to consider these possibilities in discussing what the stakes that are involved in this part of the world. We need to at least consider that possibility.
More, right there. Yeah, right there, behind you.
My name is Khavar, and I'm a freelance journalist, work with FPACs. Recently came back from Afghanistan. Originally, I am a Pakistani, I would like to put few points, in fact, in a bigger picture which is portrayed. I do agree the majority of these thoughts coming from the panel. First thing I would like to point out, which I learned recently in Pashtun or non-Pashtun parts of Afghanistan, is that the solid pro-government provinces or places whatsoever the communities are not only taken as the solid pro-government, but in Pashtun states they are also taken as anti-Pashtun. This is an ethnic, I would say, conflict which is sharpened. If you talk about Kunduz, so there are only 4 districts in Kunduz who are all Pashtun and where the whole disturbance is. And then the reaction coming
I'm
from
sorry, I
the...
would have to ask if admonition, we're running out of time to see if you have a question.
Okay, the second point is when you talk about Lashkar-e-Taiba and put all the focus on Pakistan, Lashkar-e-Taiba is the still biggest client of Saudi money, and no one talk about that. Third, Saudis. And third is when you talk about India-Pakistan and the conflict, which is causing a lot of trouble, no one is, in fact, pointing out the problem between these two countries, and international community is not taking it seriously, how to bring these two countries together under the common interest of international community. So why we shy away talk about Kashmir?
Honestly, I'm going to argue, and this is where gentle persons have to agree to disagree. Pakistan and India's failure to resolve Kashmir is symptomatic. It is not causal. There's absolutely nothing that India could do that will make Pakistan feel that some resolution is acceptable. I actually think this idea that you resolve Kashmir and resolve the bilateral issue, howsoever chimeric that is and may be, that will not shift Pakistan's fear in Afghanistan. And the reasons follows as such. India has an enormously successful economy. It has weathered this global crisis phenomenally. Even though it keeps its percentage of GDP on military expenditure somewhere around 2.3%, in real terms, it's huge. It is an extra-regional power. It is becoming a global power. It enjoys relations with the United States, with Israel, with virtually every other country that generally sees Pakistan as a threat. It has better relations with Iran. Iran has issues with Pakistan. Obviously, Jandula, based in Pakistan, is an issue. Its commercial interest in Iran, its commercial interest in Central Asia, and its trajectory, even while it's afraid of China strategically, it's still managing that relationship very successfully, while China is beginning to see Pakistan is a source of insecurity for reasons that we all know. So India's trajectory is going like this. Pakistan's trajectory is going like that. So even if you could magically resolve the Kashmir issue, and there are reasons why India might want to do that for its own domestic reasons, it is a complete fiction to believe that that is somehow going to make Pakistan's neuralgic concerns about India evaporate. And I think this is a debate that the international community has been sucked into at Pakistan's behest. And but a reasoned and seasoned assessment of Pakistan's cost-benefit analysis suggests that that's just not going to fix the problem.
Almost 10 years ago, a senior former Indian Foreign Secretary, J.N. Dixit, said to me that that the Indians were willing to settle the Kashmir problem. It was an easy fix. You just turn the line of control into the international border. The Pakistanis aren't going to go for that for several reasons. First, why would the Pakistani military how would it be able to justify 70% of the federal budget anymore to buy weapons? That's the first problem. The second problem is settling the Kashmir issue goes to the entire raison d'etre of Pakistan. This was a country that was supposed to be founded as the homeland of South Asia's Muslims. Suddenly, the Pakistani government agrees to give away half of the only Muslim-dominated state in India. What reason does Pakistan have to exist anymore?
I want to thank all the panelists for excellent presentations. And a great note to finish on. And there'll be future events hopefully as part of this forum between New America and CAP, so please keep abreast of that. Thank you very much.
Don't disagree.